Hi friends, Elliot here, Lazy Dogs Records, and tonight I'm going to start a series that I want to share with everybody. I hope you'll find interesting. I'll try to make it interesting. I'm going to talk about the close harmony singing, the brother acts in country music, and it started really in the 1930s, and the advances in technology. You had improvements in amplification for personal appearances, for live performances, and you had the improvements in recording for making 78s. And it enabled singers to not have to project so loudly, and it opened up more possibilities in the singing. It allowed you to include more subtlety, and it made it a much more colorful way of singing, because before you had your amplification and you were singing to a crowd of people, you really had to project way out, and just shout basically. You've seen the old singers from the 20s that would sing into the megaphone and things like that. Well, it's because they were singing to a large crowd and you had to project. And with these improvements, it allowed singers to become more articulate, more varied in how they sang, and so it presented a much better musical sound with these technological changes. So these close harmony singing duos became very popular in the 1930s in what they then called hillbilly music, which is an awful term, very derogatory term. Unless you live in the mountains, you should not ever refer to anybody as a hillbilly. That's just my point of view. One person living in the mountains can call another person in the mountains a hillbilly. But I live in the flatlands. I've lived in the mountains before. As a flatlander, whether I lived in the mountains or not, I was always a flatlander. I knew the boundaries, and one included not insulting someone from there by calling them a hillbilly. But that was the name given, like race records for black artists, hillbilly for rural, mainly southern, but not all southern, rural musical acts. Well, sometimes, or oftentimes, the best close harmony singers are siblings, especially brothers. And sometimes it's called blood harmony, because some people think it's in the DNA. I really don't. I think it's because they've been singing together all their lives, and they know each other, and it's intuitive to them because they are so close to one another. I don't think there's anything DNA about it. I think it's from singing together so much. Well, a lot of these acts emerged in the 1930s. There were the Dixon Brothers, the Carlisles. There was a sister act called the Davis Sisters, which obviously aren't brothers, and also weren't sisters. I think they were cousins. Unfortunately, one sister died in an auto accident, I believe, or one member of the group, they were cousins, died in an auto accident, and they tried to keep the act going with brought someone else in, but eventually it faded, and one member, the surviving member of the Davis Sisters, was Skeeter Davis, who became a popular country singer in her own right. But the four I'm going to highlight in this presentation are the Monroe Brothers, Charlie and Bill, the Delmore Brothers, the Louvin Brothers, and the one I'm going to talk to you about in this video, the Blue Sky Boys. You notice something right there off the bat, a little bit different. All the others say brothers or sisters. They didn't designate that, but they were siblings, the Blue Sky Boys. And it's important to emphasize the church and its role in creating this music. Now, the church was the center of rural life. There, you worked. Most people were farmers, and you farmed on in kind of in isolation from one another all week, and eventually, on Sunday you gathered at church, and maybe Saturday afternoon there were events, and this was true in all working class society, um, black, white, native, whatever. It was just uh, centered around work and the church. And so the church was the center of rural life. And, oftentimes church would have dinner on the grounds. There would be singing all day, things like that. I know one story where I live here in North Carolina. We have a distinguished writer named Paul Green, who won a Pulitzer Prize, I believe, for In the Bosom of Abraham, a play he wrote. He also wrote lots of plays, lots of short stories, and he wrote in Hollywood eventually. He wrote Betty Davis's favorite line from a movie. She says, "I'd love to kiss you, but I just washed my hair." Paul Green wrote that. Well, he grew up just about 4 miles from where I'm sitting right now in Harnett County, North Carolina. Generally speaking, an area called Bowie's Creek. And we call it Bowie's Creek, but Bowie's Creek's how you say it. He wrote a short story called The Corn Shucking. And I taught 8th grade North Carolina U.S. history for over 3 decades. And I tried to read this story to the students, or have the students read the story, and we discussed it a lot when we talked about life on the farm. And it's a short story about going to a corn shucking when the community gathers. It's one of the few times the community gets together during the time when you're trying to get all that corn that you've pulled, get it all shucked, and families would take turns and they'd have a big meal. And he talked about he was a good singer. He could sing in a harmony group, a gospel group, and he would show off. It talks about showing off for his favorite girl. And one of the things I thought was cute about it, there would be 2 big stacks of corn. Everybody would be shucking. The adults would be shucking one, and the teenagers, they weren't called teenagers back then, of course, would be shucking another pile. And you always wanted to work your way around so you were out of the sight line of the adults, because they play a little game. And if you got one of those multicolored ears of corn when you shucked it, you got to kiss your girl. That little game they played there. But he talked about how important it was, and how having that ability to sing, raised his status in the community. And so there's a lot to this, to the singing in church. Now, one of the important things about singing in the church was that they brought in singing schools. People came down and taught what were called shape note singing. They taught you how to read the shape notes so that you could sing the harmony parts and things like that. And you didn't have to just do call and response. That most people were, not most, but a large percentage of people were illiterate. Maybe more than half of the people that were living on the farms in up until World War II, probably half the people didn't have a strong grasp of the written word. And this will enable them to read the music parts. So that was important to have those schools at the churches. They would come into the church and they would teach the whole community how to short note sing, and then they would have big sings. And that was a very popular activity centered around the church, singing. And most of these, if not all, I think all really, grew up in a church setting where the music was emphasized like that. Okay, the Blue Sky Boys, and I'll let you get a closer look at them, are Bill and Earl Bullock. There they are, Bill and Earl Bullock, the Blue Sky Boys. And They grew up in the foothills, or on up into the mountains a little bit from the foothills, in and around a town called Hickory, North Carolina. And Bill was born in 1917, and he would live into his late 70s. He would die in 2008. And Earl was born 2 years later, 1919. And, oh, I'm sorry, I got that backward. Earl was born in 2019 and would die in 1998. So he lived about 70 into his late 70s. And Bill, who played the mandolin, he was born in 1917. He would live to 2008. So he was, 83, 91 or so when he passed away. So they were young during their music career for the most part. They were raised in the Church of God, and the hymns from the Church of God were very important to them. A lot of these hymns in the Church of God, hymnal, were written only about 30 years before this by a couple of ministers. They put together many of the songs in that hymnal, and that's all. They did a lot of sacred songs, and a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of them came from the Church of God hymnal. And by the time they were in their mid teens, they were pretty proficient on musical instruments. Each played some mandolin and guitar, and they switched them around. But ultimately, the way it worked out, the older brother, Bill, ended up playing most of the mandolin parts. Mandolin was a fairly new instrument in the area. There weren't that many people that played the mandolin, but it was a nice stringed instrument, small. You could move around with it, travel from place to place without much difficulty with it. So it made for a good instrument for singing with. And then Earl primarily played the guitar. Well, by the time they were 16 and 18 years old, they were working in Asheville at WWNC radio station. Now, remember, radio was very important because that's how you made your money. You got a little bit of money to play a show. Sometimes it was like a 6 a.m. show each weekday morning that you would play. Sometimes it was the noon show. And I guess sometimes it was evening show, but you're losing your signal in AM as the sun goes down, so probably not. But see, the thing was, you were playing to a rural audience. So you might have a show from 6 to 6:30, 6:30 to 7, something like that, when the farmers and their families are getting up, eating breakfast, and getting ready to get out to work. And so they would listen to the show then, and then they would come in from the fields at noon to eat lunch, and they could listen to the radio then. So you had those shows, but what they were used for, you got paid for them, but they promoted a product, so you got some, that was your sponsor, you got some pay for that. But they would advertise their shows, and they would go to the surrounding areas and play schoolhouses and auditoriums, and carry tents sometimes and set them up in the field and play whatever they could do to get some live gigs during the week and on the weekends. That's what they would do. They would eventually start cutting records, and you could make some money cutting records, but people weren't becoming millionaires doing that. There was only so much money to be made at that. So within a year, they had left WWNC in Asheville, North Carolina, and they had gone to Atlanta. And they had splintered off from the group they were with, and they had formed their duo. They came up with the name Blue Sky Boys because the mountains of North Carolina were the land of the sky, or the land of the blue sky, and they were the Blue Ridge Mountains. So Blue Sky Boys is what they came up with. And like I say, these boys were 1936 and born in 17. That makes them 19. One's 19 and one's 17. At this point, they've left home and they're in Atlanta, Georgia, big city, playing at WGST in Atlanta. And they get signed to RCA. Bluebird, I believe, was the subsidiary of RCA. Over the next 4 years, they did over 100 recordings. and they had some popular songs. They split it between gospel and secular music, and it was music of the times. A lot of it was tragic stories, murder ballads, uh, songs of salvation, songs of sin, and salvation, I guess you'd say, warnings, the dangers of sin, and they became very popular. And they look at the discography of the Blue Sky Boys. Classic songs are among what they recorded: "Sunny Side of Life," "Where the Soul Never Dies," which is a great inspirational gospel song. Think of the title, "Where the Soul Never Dies." Okay. They had in 1938 they had a hit with Katie Deer, which was a tragic murder-suicide story. So here's Katie Deer.
If you can be a bride of mine, if she said yes, come back and tell me. If she says no, we'll run away. Oh, Willie dear.
And then they had another hit the same year with "Beautiful Brown Eyes."
Beautiful brown eyes, beautiful brown eyes, beautiful brown eyes. I'll never love blue eyes again. Last night I staggered in the barnyard, fell right down at the door. These were the words that I uttered: I'll never get drunk anymore. Beautiful brown eyes, beautiful.
Other songs that we know, like "Turn Your Radio On." Everybody probably knows that song. "Banks of the Ohio," murder ballad. Let's see, "Turn Your Radio On" in Banks, Ohio. We're in 1941 now. Of course, you know what happened late fall 1941. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and that changes everything. So World War II for the United States begins, and Bill and Earl quickly enlist, and so there's no music coming out from them and so many other artists from 1942 to 1946. Remember, this was our greatest generation, people. These guys were in their mid-20s now, and they went out and saved the world. Let's face it. My generation didn't do squat. My parents' generation, they saved the world in World War II. Bill was in the Philippines. He fought in the Philippines, and he fought at Okinawa. Earl was in the European theater. He was a paratrooper. He was on the Normandy invasion. He crossed the Rhine. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. And they're lucky they came out alive. A lot of people, obviously didn't. But they came back. They returned to Atlanta. They got discharged in 1946. They returned to Atlanta and picked up where they left off. Now they're still with RCA, but the records aren't on Bluebird. They're on RCA Victor now, and of course they're doing 78s. So the discography is all 78s. In 1946 and 1947, they had more hits, some of their biggest hits. They had in 1946, they had a gospel number called "Dust on the Bible," which will break your heart. It is, and they had another hit with Kentucky. in 1947. And here's Kentucky.
You are the dearest land outside of heaven to me. Kentucky.
All right, back. And problem was the world had changed after World War II. Honky tonk was taking over as the country music subgenre of choice, and those songs about home and heartache and the sacred songs just weren't selling anymore. RCA wanted them to change their sound, and we'll remember that. I mean, it happens in all. We know in the 80s how all of a sudden all these guitar-driven rock bands were pushed to add synthesizers and to change up their sound and create a different image. Well, a lot of people did change. The Bullock Boys, no, they said no electric guitar in our music, and they refused. They didn't record again. They didn't record in '48 at all, and they recorded a little bit more in '49, '50, and by 1951 they decided that they'd had a good run. It was time to hang it up. So in '51 they retired. Bill moved back to North Carolina and went to work at the post office, and Earl stayed in Georgia and went to work at Lockheed, the aircraft, I believe, what Lockheed does. By '63, the folk boom was big, and a label had released some of on an album, 33 and Third album had released some of their work, and they got lured back into recording, and that's when they recorded this album in '62, '63, right here. And this is Together Again. They recorded this one and Precious Moments, which was a gospel, so this secular one and a gospel album. And they did the folk college tours, folk circuit, and in '65 they did a recording for Capitol at UCLA. They played at Los Angeles at UCLA, and they got put out an album, a live performance there. They did the folk circuit for a little while, but I'm not positive, but I believe they were pretty much holding down full-time jobs and just going out on the weekends and vacation days and things like that to do these performances, because they're still not that old. They're they're in their 40s at this point. And that faded down after a while. By the late '60s, they weren't really playing much of anywhere anymore. One was in Georgia, one was in North Carolina. And then in '75, Rounder Records put out an album of recordings by them, and they started playing the bluegrass and folk circuit for a while, for a few years. But I think they realized they weren't going to make a huge ton of money doing this. So there's a '63 album. At the same time, when they were preparing to do this album, they just got a simple tape recorder and plugged a mic into that just simple tape recorder to rehearse with each other and practice, because they hadn't sung together in a few years. They just draped a mic over the back of a straight back chair and recorded. And he say they sounded so good without Bill or Earl, whichever one did the recording, that he saved the recordings, and County Records, very good traditional music label, took those recordings, and they were able to get 10 really high quality songs just out of a little tape recorder. And that's this album right here. And what you've been hearing has come from this album, which is enhanced to simulate stereo and all that sort of stuff. But these, from best I can tell, these recordings are taken from the old 78s, and just he worked on them as best they could to get crackles and pops out of them, and put it on a 2-record set right here. So that's one of the most important and influential of the close harmony acts that came out in the 1930s. The next one I'll do will be on the Monroe Brothers. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll enjoy the next one. Take care.